This is John Byrne, the lead pastor here at Grace Fellowship, and this is the Grace Deep Dive Podcast, recorded deep in the depths of the Grace Fellowship basement here in Lakewood, Colorado. We dive a little deeper into Sunday's sermon.
I'm Johnny McCloskey, and I'll be your host on the Grace Deep Dive Podcast.
Well, welcome back out there in Facebook and YouTube land. We're down in the basement at Grace Fellowship.
Deep diving.
How
does the intro go? Deep down in the depths of
our soul.
Something or
like
other.
That. Something like that. Yeah, I guess we don't hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Whereas you may hear it more often than we do.
Yeah, right.
So you could tell us actually.
We don't even hear it like when it plays the intro. Like it's just totally silent on our end.
Yeah,
so.
we're just half the time like I'm like.
That's why he's like, what? Wait,
are we going now?
Started?
Are we starting? Yeah, you know this is the week on holy sex, John.
Holy sex.
We're still in the series Family Life, episode 87.
We are.
And it's one of those times you talked about holy sex. It's when you hear that title, I always go back to like the Batman. Like
I know,
Batman
right?
Stuff,
Isn't it crazy how that stuff sticks with you? Because I do the same thing.
Yeah,
I'm ashamed to admit it, but it is true.
We all none of us like to admit that we used to watch those campy Batmans. I know I was a little bit young for those things, but they're still pretty good. But
right.
yeah, it was an interesting title actually. Felt a little, when you hear about it, it sounds a little controversial a little bit at first, just like holy and then sex putting it together, because I think sometimes we do. Sex is a beautiful thing. It is a holy thing.
Well, it should be anyways. Yeah, for sure.
But we have, as a culture, and a society, and as a people, have kind of dirtied up sex a little bit to where it's like to put holy and sex next to each other, it almost seems sacrilegious in some ways.
Right.
But sex wasn't meant to be that way.
No, absolutely not. It's a beautiful thing. It's given to us by God. That was the whole idea that we find in the opening chapters of Genesis, right? The man and the woman becoming one flesh. That is the sexual act of course, in at least part, kind of does that for us, right? It gives us kind of that. I don't know how should you say it, but it's a tool given to us to accomplish God's purposes, and part of that is both intimacy and sex, but also the created order as well. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
And to kind of even populate the earth and fulfill that commandment. Yeah, John, what do you think? Why is sex become such a dirty topic, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is very personal, right? It's about as personal as you can get and intimate as you can get, and so because of that, I think a lot of times, we have all kinds of good things that God has given us in all kinds of ways, but when it comes to the issue of sex, when that gets and I really don't, I'm not even using this word in a sexual way, because we pervert God's goodness, and that doesn't have to be a sexual thing. That can be anything.
It was perversion
that is given to us by God. It can be
misuse,
perverted.
Right? It's a misuse of something that was intended.
It's a misuse of something else. But in sex, when that was perverted, it's personal. And I think that matters as to why it becomes so hard to talk about, so hard to touch. And it hurts, too, when it's abused, when that issue is abused and people are the victims of, either sexual assault or other deviations from God's design, and it hurts people, and it hurts them very personally. And so it becomes very hard to talk about, and so we kind of hide it, and then it becomes kind of dirty. It's that thing that we don't talk about.
Mm-hmm. I think also, like, you think about too, when God, I always jokingly go, God, this is tough because you created something that's so pleasurable,
right?
Like, why did you do that? It's like saying, God, your gift was actually too good,
right?
If you could have made it a little bit less pleasurable, then we wouldn't have perverted it. We wouldn't have made it so dirty. We wouldn't have tried to make it something it wasn't supposed to be. It's that pleasure piece.
Mm-hmm. Well, and honestly, I think we overestimate that piece of it too, the fulfillment anyway side of it, right? Like we overestimate how that will fulfill all our needs or make us happy in life or whatever. Like it'll be this one thing that kind of fixes everything. I mean, I don't know how you were before you got married and that kind of stuff, but it seems like our culture is so sexualized, and it tells us that if we will engage in all these sexual things, then our life will be good. That's the measure of the good life is engaging in these things. And if you do whatever it is, even if it's a deviant form of it, if you do whatever it is that you desire, that'll make you happy in some ways. But the problem is that a lot of times that's done, and then we're not happy. We don't find fulfillment and happiness in it. So the physical pleasure may be very enjoyable, but it's also short-lived, right? And so those things, might be enjoyable and good in those sense, and it's given to us by God to be good and to be enjoyable. But we overestimate, I think, the amount of fulfillment and joy that it'll give us in life. That will meet all our needs if we will just not even just the sexual act, but all of our sexuality.
Interesting point, because I think my mindset was, no, it is very pleasurable. It's very euphoric. It's very it makes you. It's like a hit of a drug.
Well, it is. Well, that's exactly what happens, right? Like literally in our brains, our body produces drugs and gives us a little bit.
And
of
the point of that,
high.
the drug, is to connect you at that moment.
That's right, with that
to
person.
That person.
That's right.
Which is why there's strings attached.
Right.
But we'll talk about that later. But so you connect really intimately on a deep, deep level at that moment, but then it doesn't last. Like you said, it's not meant to be the fix
for everything. Right.
And you see in our culture, what you see is people will now have to pervert it because they get the hit and it feels great in the moment, and they want to make it last. They want to figure out a way to prolong this, and they might even, that's where they might go to different levels.
Yeah.
They might do things that are not designed, and then, or like you say, not like you said, but you begin to experiment.
Yeah.
You want looking for that hit as often as you can, and as long as you can. Even adding other drugs like ecstasy or something like that, you might add that to heighten the experience and maybe prolong it as long as you can.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's true. And of course, there's a difference between the physical fulfillment, right, and the fulfillment of the two becoming one, right? And you kind of reference that, and I think that is super important. Sexual sin is a sin against our own body, which is given to us by God and is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that's Paul talks about that. This is a different kind of sin because it's so personal, it's so connected to our identity and who we are and those kinds of things, and so those sins impact us. But there's a difference between the physical fulfillment, which is momentary pleasure, physical pleasure, and those kinds of things. The drug hit that our body produces a drug, and it gives us this little bit of high, if you will, if you want to call it that.
And it's like an imprinting, I've heard, too.
Yeah.
Like it imprints you upon each other.
Well, and I think that's the aspect of where there is a spiritual side to it and a psychological side and an emotional side to it, where this is the person, right? This is the person that I'm connecting with, which is how God designed it to be, the two becoming one flesh. It's not just the physical act of becoming one flesh. It's the spiritual, emotional, and psychological aspect of becoming one flesh as well.
So let's talk a little bit more about that idea of strings attached.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, you think, well, just, I'll have sex with whoever I want. It's not a big deal.
Right.
But there are, and especially when you talk about, I guess I always I have three daughters, so it's always I always worry about that more for them
from the daughter perspective, yeah.
Emotionally sense, but you feel like guys are just more they'll just do whatever,
Right.
But there are strings attached, not just and I don't know if you want to expound on what specific strings. We talked a little bit about the emotional connection, and if you're listening out there. And a lot of people try to deny that.
Yeah.
There's no emotional, it's just...
Yeah, they try to separate.
It's just sex. It's just whatever.
It's kind of a modern day form of Gnosticism, if you want to think about it that way. So Gnosticism was like a second century cult, or ideology or whatever, belief, theology, not necessarily cult, but theology, if you will. And it's not a Christian theology, but it was influenced the church. And you maybe at times in Scripture you see Paul addressing some of the pre-Gnostic ideas. Gnosticism hadn't been fully developed, but you see some of these. The separation, the idea is that there's a separation between the physical and the non-physical world, and the physical. And so there's two ways that sometimes played out. One is that you subdued the physical. You maybe beat yourself or, starved yourself or those kinds of things. But the other way it played out is that nothing I do in the physical matters for me in the spiritual or in the non-physical realm.
Either they attach it too much or not enough.
They over attach it or not enough. So they either try to take that which is physical and beat it into submission and make it good in that way, or they totally separate it. And so what you do physically has no impact on your emotions or your psychology or morality or any of those things, because it's a total separation. So that was two ways that people went with it, but that's not how God designed us. He designed us as embodied souls. We are souls, that's the immaterial part, but we have bodies, and those bodies were given to us by God, and they are connected. And so we shouldn't make that hard separation like that. And that's what people try to do sometimes with sex, is they try to make this hard separation where, well, that's just, I'm engaging in this physical act, but it doesn't really mean anything, right? Mm-hmm. You hear that phrase all the time, and maybe somebody commits adultery or something, and then they come back to their spouse, and their spouse finds out, and they go, well, it didn't mean anything.
I love her.
Yeah. In other words, they were trying to have no strings attached. They're trying to completely separate the physical from the emotional and the psychological. And it just doesn't work that way. We're not designed that way. God designed us, as I said, as embodied souls, and they are all connected. And that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, because when that sexual act and our sexuality is exercised in the boundaries of God's design, then all the physical things and all the non-physical things work together in a beautiful way, and they create harmony. And that's why it's important for us to understand what those boundaries are, and then to approach our sexuality within those boundaries.
You see a lot of times in just all in humanity, what we do is we know there's a string attached to sex, whether it's an unwanted pregnancy at the time,
right,
their STDs, emotional attachment, heartbreak, all that kind of stuff, and we see ourselves trying to snip at these strings,
right,
and kind of almost like deny that they're there,
right.
And what is there any? I know that I answered this, but what kind of harm is there in detaching these strings that are attached? Yeah, well, I mean, there's significant harm, and this comes out physically too. Steve Arterburn, he co-wrote the book Every Man's Battle, which I don't remember how long. It's an older book now. I think 90s, it feels like.
Yeah, but there's an article that just came out this past week, actually. I didn't mention it on Sunday, but in Church Leaders, churchleaders.com, and Stephen with PH, Stephen Arterburn. And the title is How Porn Led to Actual Death in My Life, right? So here's this pornography, sexual. It's not a victimless crime. There's all kinds of ways in which it affects the person participating, but obviously if the people you're watching as well, it affects them. But not only that, but so Steve Arterburn talks about how when he was in college, and he went to a Christian college, it's the one in Texas. What's the name of that school? He went to a Christian college, and he got a girl pregnant, and he had, pornography had been a part of his life, and so he simply saw this as a problem to be fixed, as opposed to a human life being brought into existence. And so he not only paid for, and he talks about in this article, I don't know Steve, and obviously it's public, it's churchleaders.com. So he's telling his testimony, and I just read it, and he not only pressures her into having an abortion, but he paid for it too. Mm-hmm. So he pays for it, and he pressures her into having this abortion. And he later spoke on this, and I think went back to the school and actually told the story. And he kind of left out. He just said he paid for, and he actually has, to the degree possible, reconciled with that woman, but she did have an abortion. So in other words, his addiction to pornography, that deviance from God's design, right? That use of it literally led to somebody dying. Mm-hmm. And so because of how he viewed women and the act of sex and all of that kind of stuff, and so a woman got pregnant and then killed the baby. Yeah. And he paid for it, and he was absolutely 100% complicit, and even held a causation in that. And it was because of how his mind had been rewired to view women because of pornography.
When we redefine terms, like, you see this a lot, and obviously, pro-life, pro-choice, that kind of stuff. When is a baby a baby, you start to redefine things so that you can detach strings, essentially.
Yeah, and
You know?
that's what happened in Roe v. Wade, right? That's what we were always, the pro-choice side of things. You go back and you read the arguments being made way back in 1973 when Roe v. Wade was passed or ruled on by the Supreme Court, and abortion was made legal in the entire nation. A lot of the arguments were, well, it's not a human. Mm-hmm. It's just a clump of cells. I still hear this. I can't believe I still hear it because the science is abundantly clear, and any question that we once had about what that is has been answered scientifically. Not just because the Bible says so, not because of what Jesus says, not because of my religious beliefs, although that spoke to those things as well, and then science confirmed what the Bible teaches about, God knitting us together in our mother's womb. And, it says in Jeremiah, I knew you before you were born, paraphrasing there, and all these things. So all of these things that the Bible said, science has shown to be true regarding what it is. And so we try to justify it and manipulate it. We turn it into something it's not. And we try to, and we separate the life-giving power of sex from sex. That's what we're attempting to do. Mm. But we do it by taking a life, an innocent life. And that's in the case of abortion anyways. And that's not, that's wrong. That's sin. We can't separate ourselves from it, from what sex was created for. We try, and we use all kinds of ways to do it, and but we can't.
I think you see a lot in just our culture and in the church and in our own lives too, where we try to, I remember you can't detach the string.
Yeah, you can't.
There's going to be accountability. There's going to be judgment. There's going to be, and I don't want to say the wrath of God, because the wrath of God has a negative connotation to it.
Right.
But God is aware. He doesn't, just because you cut a string of the strings that are attached and you detach those strings, they're still attached.
Yeah.
And no matter how much we want to justify that,
right,
God is still going to, he knows.
Yeah.
Why do you think, just talking about the wrath of God, and I've heard some people say that sometimes the wrath of God, like if he sees you doing it and he doesn't step in,
right,
then he kind of appears to be okay with it. In your mind, in your justifying mind.
Sure.
So you're like, oh, well, he didn't stop it.
Right.
So maybe it's okay. Because if we could justify a clump of cells,
right,
then we could justify that God's not going to, that he's not super angry with it, or he's just going to let it slide, know? But in reality, he notices everything.
Well, and not only that, but and I even hate to bring it down because it's not all about the abortion issue either, right?
No,
it's not, because there's a sense in which you connect with that person, right? You are becoming one flesh with whoever that person is, and like you talked about the imprint on our mind, that's absolutely true, and so, and God knows that, and He designed it that way. It's supposed to be good. Sex is supposed to deepen the relationship between a husband and a wife.
Between people, whatever that is, it's going to deepen it.
Well, if it's sex, it's between a husband and a wife.
Yeah,
it should be between a husband and a wife.
And if it's not, it's going to deepen it.
If it's not, yeah. And as a matter of fact, I remember, one time many, many years ago, I was in youth ministry, and this young man came to me, and he says, hey, I'm thinking about having sex with my girlfriend. And I was like, oh, okay. I go, well, let me ask you a question. What do you think is going to happen after that? He's like, I don't know. What do you mean? And I go, God gave us boundaries for a reason. And I go, if you choose to do this, there are going to be consequences. You and that girl are going to connect in a way that you haven't connected before. There are going to be emotional, psychological consequences to this. She is going to be connected to you. And oftentimes it's different how men and women connect to each other in this process. And I kind of walked through him what the results were going to be. And with him, and I said, if you do this, if you make this decision, then the consequences are, because what you are doing is you're basically becoming married in a sense. That that's you're consummating a marriage that doesn't exist, so to speak. And so he decided to do it anyways. And then he came back to me, and later, and he just looked at me and said, John, you were so right on every single thing I told him, that was going to happen. It happened. And it just happens. You connect emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. You connect in those moments. So if you're going from partner to partner to partner, all of a sudden those connections become less meaningful, right?
The others.
And pretty soon you've built up a,
Callousness.
we'll call it a tolerance or a callous to what is supposed to happen. That's not good. You know, what is supposed to happen. If you're with one partner and you stay with that partner, then the connection is deeper each time, and it's good. And it's not a callous thing. And so not in the same way anyways. So there are no ways of getting around it. The strings are attached. It's a connection. It's intended to be that way. It's a spiritual connection, and it's good when it's done within the boundaries which God gave us, which is between one man, one woman in marriage.
So yeah, I don't know. You know, I always advise people when they're, young couples and stuff. First of all, if you want to stay with this person and be married to them, which I hope is the goal.
Yeah.
Don't mess it up by doing that kind of stuff.
Right.
It's not gonna. And then also, if you wanted to have incredible heartbreak.
Yep.
When you break up.
Yep.
Because if you do have sex, you're probably gonna break up, especially if you have a spiritual.
I know, right? People think it's the opposite,
Yeah.
right? Because you hear this all the time with cohabitating. Well, we cohabitated because before we got married, so it'll probably last. No. The opposite is true. Statistically, if you cohabitate before you get married, it fails much more often than if you don't. If you do things right, if you do things the way God designed, you save sex for marriage, all those kinds of things, and you don't cohabitate, you don't mimic marriage before you get married, then that commitment level that when you say I do and you make those vows for better, for worse, till death do us part, all that stuff, and sickness and health, et cetera, then you're much more likely to have a successful marriage.
Yeah.
It's not close, statistically.
It's ironic that the thing, if done in marriage, if you have sex in marriage, it creates a bond.
Yeah.
If you have sex outside of marriage, it creates a bond, but it also adds guilt.
It adds guilt, it adds shame,
breaks it up,
and the likelihood that you'll break up increases.
Yeah, and then the hurt increases.
Yeah,
and then like you said, as you add multiple partners, you just callous yourself to that.
And then to some degree, I suppose you're successful in the sense that you separate the physical act from the emotional, psychological, and spiritual things that are supposed to connect with it. But that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing, because then when you want that, it's gone.
Yeah, purely physical.
You
lose the rest.
Yeah, you lose everything else.
Sean, what about the argument that I hear sometimes of, well, you got to test drive. You got to know if you're compatible.
It's great if you're buying a car.
If you have to know. You have to know. Is this person going to be what I need sexually? I got to try it out first before I get married.
So what question are you really asking, John? Let's just do a little interview here. Well, what question are you really asking when you say that? This isn't my
question.
I know it's not.
But the question is, how do I know if they're going to be good? I guess I don't know. Like, how do I know?
So what's it all about at that moment?
It's all selfish.
It's selfish.
Yeah.
It's about you, right?
It's all about your physical too.
It's about the physical pleasure you get. What are my needs met?
It's like you said too. Sorry, like you said, it's the idea of if it's a physical, spiritual, emotional thing, that's the way God intended it. We begin to pervert it and break it apart. We try to discard the emotional and the spiritual. We elevate just the physical.
That's right.
And then we pervert the heck out of that thing.
And it has been perverted in so many ways. I mean,
and that's what they're looking for is how do you make this physical piece? And man, what a terrible thing to expect from your partner to try to make something that is physical and momentary. To remove the other two pieces,
right,
and elevate this physical thing, which is only supposed to last for a few minutes, whatever. We'll talk about that.
We're not going to
talk about that. But like, it's not meant to last. It's a quick thing. It's over. It's done.
If it's a physical thing, it's over. It's done quickly.
Yeah, and there's no emotional. And then you just have this like, what? That's an incrable burden or response to ask your partner to. That's like a run. That's like run, right? If you hear that, right. It's like if someone asks you, like if you're dating and they say we need to have sex to find out if we're compatible.
It's like, and I'm just gonna break this down because the language you use, and I know it's not your language. You're using the language of the world, but the language you use is so instructive to us, right? Because you go, well, I got to find out if we're compatible. I just want to make something clear. There's a male part and there's a female part, and they work together.
Yeah. They're compatible.
They're compatible. Yeah. Now, there might be physical abnormalities or some crazy thing, but no, they're designed to work together. They work together. Like the whole compatibility thing is silly and ridiculous. And you think about, and we're gonna get real kind of personal here, but you think about it, and the whole idea of the honeymoon. Everybody's like the honeymoon, right? Especially guys. I think this is less so with ladies, but the honeymoon, and it's gonna be great and amazing and whatever. And can I just be honest with you? The honeymoon sex, if you've waited, isn't the best sex you're ever gonna have. It's probably not even close, right? Like it takes time. You learn each other, you grow with each other in the act, physically, spiritually, all those things.
Yeah.
And so the best sex you have is later, much later, usually, after maybe years, and maybe even many years, and people don't think about that. Like it's not about the compatibility thing. That's not the issue. That is not what you should be concerned about.
And that should be concerning to you if you're hearing that from somebody, because they're saying you need to make this physical thing amazing.
Right.
And that's all I
Yeah, you got to live up, you got to perform for me.
And that's all I am. That's all I
Right.
have is that. It's like, no, there's more to it.
It's a performance that it's terrible. That's a terrible way to approach a relationship. And yeah, so that whole thing is a lie from the pit of hell, and we should reject it. And that's not, love is not what you do for me. Love is what can I do for you.
Yeah.
And that's what we see in Ephesians chapter 5, right? Where husbands are told, love your wife as Christ loved the church. And what did he do? He gave himself up for her, right? He went to the cross. He bled for her. He died for her. He made the ultimate sacrifice, so that the marriage between Jesus and the church could be eternal, right? The marriage supper of the Lamb that we see at the end of Revelation, and we see that fulfillment of that promise. And that's why marriage, and we've talked about that, is a picture of that relationship, and it's supposed to be for eternity, forever. That's the one marriage that does last forever. So when we get married, it's for this lifetime, but hopefully.
The way I would always respond to that, which I think is actually now pretty shallow now they look at it, but it would always be, why do I not test drive, And you kind of mentioned the compatibility, we're all compatible. And if you don't have a lot of comparison, then your spouse is going to be the best you've ever had.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, then do you compare? Are you missing out? Because let's say I've only had my wife's cooking. Well, there's some 5-star restaurant chefs that are amazing. And I go, well, I guess there's an argument there. If you're going just on physical, there is probably better food out there. There's probably better quote unquote sex out there, purely physical.
Right.
But then also there's always something better than that.
Yeah.
It's never going to end. I mean, I've had pizza that I've loved. And though this pizza, I'm gonna always try pizza because I love it. But I'm gonna eventually get to a place. I'll never get to a place where I'm gonna be happy with this pizza place.
Right. Yeah. Jonathan Grant talks about this in his book Divine Sex, which, by the way, there are multiple books called Divine Sex. And if you're gonna go read this book, make sure you get the one by Jonathan Grant, because they are not all. Let's just say they don't all have a biblical worldview. Okay. I recommended this book to somebody, and they went and bought it. I didn't give them the author, and they're like, they went and bought it, and they started reading it, and they're like, John, are you sure I got the right book? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then they told me author. I'm like, no, wrong book. And it was this book like promoting pornography and all this crazy stuff. Anyway, so you got to get the Jonathan Grant one. Anyways, he talks about this, and especially this is for single people too, right? Like, so single people, because they're the ones who want to test drive. The problem is this, that they'll test drive this one, and then they'll be scared of commitment because they're always scared. What if there's something better? Oh, yeah. What if I wait just a little bit longer? Could the next one be even better? And that's not just with the sexual act. That's often with just their approach to relationships. In other words, they don't make the commitment because they think they might be missing out on something they have not yet found.
Sure.
And so that's a problem in our culture. And really that's why I think when you find somebody, compatibility issues aren't completely unimportant. They matter, relationally and things like that, right? But there is a sense to which if you sit there and just wait looking for the perfect fit, right? It's true. Buy a used car. Buy a used car. They're never perfect, right? You buy a brand new car, they're more perfect, but even then they have recalls and all these kinds of things, right? Like, so I just, that I don't want to take that analogy too far, but that
you don't know where that's going to go.
Yeah, that could get bad if we go too far with that. But the whole idea is this whole test driving thing. That's not it. At some point, you find somebody who, to a reasonable degree, is compatible. To a reasonable degree, they follow Jesus, they love Jesus. There's enough compatibility that that the relationship can be good and positive and work and all these kinds of things, then, and then you follow through, and you, at some point you got to go, well, this is the person I'm going to love the rest of my life. And once you make that decision, you've made that decision.
Yeah. It's funny because I think we think the first thing you should be looking for is physical first. When we think that's what everyone.
You need to explain that statement.
The physical aspect of sex. Are they attractive? Are they, what I'm saying?
What do you mean? Like, that's what we should be looking for?
No, that's what we think.
That's why I say you need to explain that. It didn't sound right.
Yeah, when you ask that question of, I got a test drive.
Oh, right.
Then your number one priority is looks.
Yeah.
Attraction and
At least,
feel.
right.
Yeah, and then it's and emotional.
Are they
and
cool?
Spirit,
Are they fun? Do they make me laugh?
Yeah, Emotional and spiritual connection is the bottom part.
Yeah.
The reality of what we should be looking for.
We should flip the script.
We need to flip it. We need to be looking for the spiritual, the emotional, and then the physical is last, because are you going to reject a spouse because you're not super physically attracted, maybe they're to their body or whatever?
Right.
I mean, is that the way we should do it? And obviously there is a connection there's an importance to physical attraction, but it should be at the bottom, because physical attraction is going to change too.
Well, yeah, you think
over time the physical.
Listen, let's just be honest. We all get uglier eventually.
I'm old. Yeah,
it's just true, right? You put on a few pounds, whatever, you wrinkles in your face, whatever, all that kind of stuff. Like it all changes over time. And if you're going to go, if the physical is the first thing, then you always want a 25-year-old spouse? Like that's
what you see.
Which you do see that. You see people trying to get that,
yeah.
and then we got all kinds of names that aren't very pleasing for people that do that kind of thing. But, yeah. So this is so sex is, and just by the way, you can read 1 Corinthians 7, even within marriage. And this is the other thing that people get wrong. Like, there is a sense in which sex is as much a thing you do for pleasure as it is a duty to your spouse. This is true both directions. And so,
which I want to talk about in a little bit. Actually.
Oh, you do? Okay, I'll wait then.
Yeah. So, but then also, like, even if we're going to flip it back too, I mean, sometimes you see if the physical thing is the most important part, then you get married often first for attraction,
right?
And the character, the spiritual, the emotional connection isn't even there.
Yeah. And I would say even emotional probably needs to even be to some degree ranked a little lower, but like the character and the spiritual, those things need to align. And emotional needs to be there, but that emotions go up and down too, and you can lose that. You can be lukewarm to it. Those kinds of things.
It's funny that that should be your it shouldn't be should I test drive them sexually. It should be what is their upside character wise and emotion, because that's going to be the thing. Spirit and character are going to be things that grow in time.
You might
everything else is going to fade in time.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So why not invest? You want to invest in
the right things.
in the spiritual and the character.
So if maybe we take that test driving analogy and go a different direction with it. We test drive a person's character. We test drive the spiritual
That's wise.
connection.
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of things. But the physical is not the part you test drive.
Yeah.
That's not part of the test drive.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about how we need to starve the evil desires, right?
Yeah.
So, like, really, I mean, honestly, like we have a physical component to sex. There is temptation. You see all around.
Yes.
It's the reason why pornography is probably $1 billion industry. Why people are being sex trafficked all the time. While even though we know as a culture this isn't good, we will never say no to it because there's just way too much money involved. You know, and there's so many people getting wealthy off it.
Yep.
So, how do we starve? How do we get rid of that desire?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? How do you get rid of it?
Yeah, it's so
What's
good.
a tangible way to starve that?
Man, I mean, it's so hard, right? And it can show itself in so many different ways. The pictures we see, Instagram, right? It doesn't have to be all out porn for it to be
An appetizer.
for it to be tempting or create thoughts in us that we shouldn't have, or those kinds of things. We don't have to go all the way to porn for that to happen. Like if your line is, well, I'm just not going to do pornography, but I'm going to look at all kinds of other things that lead my mind to go that direction, then you're feeding that desire. And I think that that's really important to recognize and realize. So we can do all kinds of things. And, one of the things I talked about was Covenant Eyes, which is what we use in our house, and it reports things you could do on your phone or your computer and things like that. That can be super helpful, but it only keep honest people honest, right? And so, and that's the thing is it really starts with a spiritual commitment and a character commitment to say, I'm going to feed the desires I have if you're married towards my spouse. If you're single, it's different. Then you've got to then you cut off those things which will lead you towards that deviant form of sexuality, whatever that is, right? It's okay for you to be attracted to somebody and to pursue whether that attraction can be a relationship that honors God and glorifies God, which would mean the physical aspect of that is down. We've already talked about prioritizing that. That's down. It might be the thing that gets us interested, but it's by far not the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And those things go away. And so whether it's, character, spirituality, those kinds of things are super important. And so pursuing that relationally as a single person and going and feeding, what am I going to add? What are the things I want to know about a person if I'm going to pursue a relationship that might lead to marriage? What are the things I want to know? I want to know about the relationship with Jesus. I want to know about their character. I want to know about how they treat their parents. I want to know about, those kind, so those things become, and others, I'm not trying to those are just off the top of my head, but those things become primary. So I'm feeding the right desire and I'm not feeding the wrong desire, right? My goal is not to get them to wear something sexy on a date. Mm-hmm. Right. Like, so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go, try to get them to wear something sexy based on where we go or manipulate the situation, whatever. So you do dates. We had a couple and they ended up not like dating too long, but their first date was church on Sunday morning here. Do you remember them?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, even what you're choosing for a date can matter. What are we going to do? We're going to go to church. What are we going to do? We're going to go hang out with other people that love Jesus and in an environment where we can get to know each other better, right? So the kinds of things you do in your dating life matter, and feed the right desires by the decisions you make. In your married life, you're choosing to engage in thoughts towards your spouse that are appropriate for a spouse, but you don't engage in those thoughts towards other people. Whether it's a picture, a stranger, or somebody none doesn't matter, right? So that takes discipline, and it takes making sure that your spiritual life is fed, and it takes being aware of your mind and your thoughts all the time, because you are going to be flooded with images and things you don't want to be, but they're going to be there in front of you. So how do you deal with that? How do you move past that, right? You resist. You avert your eyes to something else. You quote a scripture verse if that's helpful. You find a way to bring yourself back to something that is good and honorable in those moments. And so those images, and then you avoid going down roads that you shouldn't go down towards pornography, maybe videos, on YouTube you watch that, or in on whatever, Amazon Prime or Netflix or Hulu or whatever your thing is, right? Like, so you don't watch certain kinds of shows. Mm-hmm. You make that decision, and it's just the ways in which you got to do it are kind of never ending, because the temptations seem to attack us everywhere.
Yeah, especially with this technology and stuff.
Yeah, everything's on our phone or computer or whatever, right?
Sex sells, so people are using it as advertisement.
Yeah, there's even robots coming out, and that's even a real issue that people are, ethically, that people are asking questions about. Well, what about having sex with a robot? Well, a robot's not a person. You're not becoming one flesh. That's not what God designed, right?
Yeah. I was gonna say. I was lined up and everything.
That's all right.
Yeah, I'll probably come back to me. So, but we did kind of mention earlier how abstaining from sex, when you're married and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think? What is that? There's a passage in Corinthians, right? Like,
1 Corinthians 7.
Have sex. Have sex, even if maybe aren't feeling it. It's important to have sex.
Yeah.
But if you're going to abstain for a short period, so that you don't fall into temptation, and for a spirit, so for basically to feed.
It's like a fast.
It's almost like feeding the good thing. Yeah. So what do you think about that passage? You want to shed on that?
Yeah, I do. I think there's kind of a fallacy out there. I think that sex is only important for guys or whatever, and that's just not true. And it's it kind of gets presented that way within marriage, that, the guy always wants to have sex and the woman doesn't. She's always tired or whatever. Well, no, that's not true. If because of those connections, those spiritual, emotional, psychological connections, sex is very important for women, and they enjoy it too, right? So there's the physical is still there, but for men and for women. And so what 1 Corinthians 7 says, what Paul says is if both partners agree, that's key. Both partners agree. And you do it for a short time, as you mentioned, Johnny. And the idea is that it's almost like a fasting from food kind of thing, where you take that time and you're committing that to growing spiritually. Maybe you do that as a couple or whatever, and you emphasize that intimacy in other ways, reading scripture together, praying together, maybe things like that. Those kinds of things can be important. But Paul basically says, but you only do it for a short time. Both partners agree, whatever. Which means the inverse of that is if both partners don't agree, then you don't abstain. You don't withhold. And there are times when maybe you don't feel like having sex with your husband or your wife, but guess what? You might need to. And that's part of serving the other person.
And there's I'm sure there's a fine line there. I mean, if you have it's probably be more the guy, like you mentioned, that has more of the drive.
Yeah, maybe.
And it's honestly because of our culture. It has fed into him so much, and made him more addicted to it. But I'm sure there's got to be for women just like an understanding, like, hey, you might have some issues too, and you're wanting it too much and almost in an inappropriate way. So we got to be careful.
Absolutely. This is not a license to abuse or to force or any of those kinds of things. But there is a sense of duty to it.
On both sides.
On both directions. And wives benefit from it, as do men. And so, it's a both and. It is not a one or the other. Paul didn't say, hey, wives, you need to have sex with your husbands whenever they want. He didn't say that. Mm-hmm. And he didn't say the opposite either. He treated both as equally important in that decision-making process. They both must agree because it's important for both of them, and they both benefit from the act of sex within marriage, related to intimacy and spiritual, obviously pregnancy, if that's what you're trying to do, and those kinds of things. So does that make sense? So it's a both and we shouldn't treat it as if it's a one-way street. It's not.
I think it would be, in my opinion, if we I think there is an elephant in the room of sex has been perverted by our culture.
Yep.
And I would say, and in most generalizations, the men are probably more broken in a certain way, and the antagonist in a lot of ways, and women can be more the victims in a general sense. Whether it's rape, whether it's expectations.
When it comes to assault and those kinds of things or unwanted advances, there's probably a lot of truth to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I tell you what, inside marriage, that has not been my experience.
I'm talking more outside marriage. Yeah. If you come in really broken.
Yeah. But obviously, and there's brokenness. The brokenness is on both sides, both as the victim and the perpetrator, right? There's brokenness that happens. Now, the sin might be on the perpetrator side, but the brokenness is on both sides.
Sure. Oh yeah. Well, that's what causes
Right. And so there's those kinds of issues, man, that it gets so complicated, so hard to deal with, and there's a lot of shame and guilt that comes along with
Every
that.
Every situation is different.
If you've been the victim of some kind of sexual assault or abuse or something like that, then there's a lot of guilt and shame that comes with that, even if it's not. You have no
because
guilt
there is a string attached. Unfortunately,
there is a string attached, and you did not. You did not pursue that. Somebody else did, and whether that was in a violent way or non-violent way, and you became the victim of it, then even if you have no sin in it, there's still a brokenness and a shame and a guilt that sometimes follows, and that's really hard to deal with because you shouldn't necessarily feel guilty or ashamed, but you do, and so that's hard to work through.
Yeah.
And as a perpetrator, there is guilt. There's appropriate guilt and shame, right? If you perpetrated some kind of sexual sin upon somebody else, then there is appropriate guilt and shame and those kinds of things. So when you come into that, it's challenging to navigate all of this. But again, I go back to what I quoted Sean McDowell, and I read the opening to his debate. If we just followed the laws of God when it came to sexuality, think of all the problems that would be solved.
The reality is, though, we haven't.
And
there's a lot of problems.
And the culture is going to continue to not.
And that's why the problem is there's problems.
But even if you as an individual follow those laws,
You won't.
then you will avoid personally a lot of those things. If you're a victim of some kind of assault, that's different. But if you, other than that, if you follow the rules and you say sex till marriage and it's between a man and woman who are married and those kinds of things, you're going to avoid all kinds of harm in your own life.
What would you say to somebody? I mean, I don't know if you were ever sexually abused, but what would you say if what would be the first thing you would try to say to somebody who was sexually abused?
Yeah. Well, I've not been, and so you got to kind of take what I say
with the granted,
with that, and just knowing I don't experientially know, and some people do, and so it's a challenge. I would just say this, that if you've been abused or assaulted or something along those lines, you are not less of a person. You are not, it's not a sin issue on your part. It is on the perpetrator's fault, but not yours. And man, God can provide healing in those circumstances. And sometimes it's amazing on how that comes. So, I don't know how to really empathize with that in a way that I think is more meaningful. But I just know this, that God heals the broken and he forgives the sinner as well. It's painful because it's extremely personal. And so it's a really hard issue to navigate.
Well, John, I remember what I wanted to talk about earlier.
Okay.
And I kind of want to jump back because I do feel like our culture is so broken sexually. Yeah. And I think, and it's almost like, obviously we're born into sin. We're all sinful beings. Right. But I feel like there's also this, as we're born, I feel like the world takes this hypodermic needle of sex and just like injects every human with it, and then perpetuates it over social media, over movies, over television, over advertising, over everything. It's just thrown in your face. It's almost like I think about you when it comes to your sugar addiction. Yeah. It's almost like we're all literally addicted to sugar, like in the form of sex, or lust. Yeah. And we have to begin to fast from it. Yeah. Is there, when you were going through your Mountain Dew fast, right? Because you were addicted to sugar. You had to have it.
I don't fast. I just don't do it.
You don't do it. But let me ask you the question. Is it, because you think of the idea, well, just train, focus on the good things, focus on the vegetables, focus on what's God honoring, what's holy, what's right, all those things. Think about these things. Don't think about the sugar and the lust and the sex and that girl that's walking by. Don't think about those things. Yeah. But it's like, but we're addicted to sugar. Like, how do we, is there hope if we say no to Mountain Dew enough? Is there hope that we will start desiring other things and that maybe we'll have some victory? Yeah,
absolutely. But I would be lying to you if I said that there's never a time that I'm not tempted to pick up a Mountain Dew even today. Like it's been years, several years, since I've had a Mountain Dew, several years, and I still get tempted sometimes. But it's a lot less. Sure, it's a lot easier to deal with.
So there's hope.
There is hope. Yeah, we train our affections, right? We train our affections. We feed the good desires, starve the bad desires. That doesn't mean that those temptations will never be there or that difficulty will never be there again. It just means that we get better at resisting it. We get better at training our minds. Our minds become more focused in the right directions and can more easily sidestep the negative, the temptations and those kinds of things. And I do find, in Hebrews where it talks about we have a Savior who's experienced every kind of temptation. He's overcome them all, right? Jesus did that. He knows the extent of temptation. We don't, because we've given into it at some point in time or another.
He knows how
incredible. And so we have a Savior who not only knows the level of temptation that we face, but he's faced that level of temptation and he overcame. Yeah. And so what, that's a hope. That gives us hope, I think. and James chapter 4, resist the devil and flee, and he will flee from you, and those kinds of things. We need to do those things. We need to resist what's bad. And so we need to watch our, the connections we make on social media and those kinds of things. We need to guard us. I think I wrote a little blog post on Ravi Zacharias and all the stuff that's going on with him. And a lot of the stuff that he did was electronic in nature, and those kinds of things. Our electronic devices can lead us down a bad road. Now, a lot of it was not electronic and was very much physical, but that can lead us down a bad road. And if it can happen to him, it can happen to you, and it can happen to me, and it can we need to guard ourselves. Feed those good desires and starve the bad ones.
Well, I think, and also you start to, not only do you gain true sexual freedom, because you don't have any guilt. There's nothing holding you back. You gain actual freedom. Yeah. Not just like sexual revolution freedom. We're talking like true sexual freedom where your emotional connection, your spiritual connection, the character is growing, the physical's there, everything's aligned and growing, and there's no guilt eating at it.
That's right.
As opposed to the world's sexual freedom, which is a physical explosion of just a desire to want more and more and more and different and better, and it never ends. There's no freedom in that. Only bondage.
Yeah, the world worships the desire. And thinking that fulfilling that desire will be freedom, but real freedom comes when we operate within the boundaries we're given, and then like you said, all the guilt and the shame and all that all that stuff is gone because we're using it appropriately. Yeah. And here's the other thing I want to say too, just before we move on, and this is because I didn't say this on Sunday. I kind of regret not saying it. I wish I would have said it on Sunday. Thankfully, we have a podcast. I can say it here. But here's the other thing. And I did say this on Sunday. Sexual brokenness has touched us all. Everybody gets touched by it in one way or another. Not in all the same ways, but in one way or another. And I just want to, make sure that people understand that sexual sin is not the unforgivable sin, whatever it is, right? And so there can be redemption, forgiveness, all those kinds of things, and you can find that in Jesus, right? And so there's whether you're the victim of some kind of sexual assault or something like that. Man, you can find a freedom from that and a restoration from that, and that only God can provide through the blood of Jesus. Like you can experience. But if you are the perpetrator of some kind of sexual sin as well, you've done it. You're responsible for that sin. You can find forgiveness in that as in Jesus too. And so it is not what you're not saying is that if you've committed a sexual sin, you've committed the unforgivable sin. We're not saying that. The Bible doesn't say that. We're not saying that.
Yeah.
And that's really important, because like I said, I think sexual brokenness, even if indirectly, touches everybody.
Yeah. Well, cool, John. Any other resources you came across?
Yeah, I think this is a good one, and it's one I'm going to use a little bit this week too as well. And I used it this last week. I quoted him on. You can do that. It's by Sean McDowell. Oh, there we go. Now it's in the right place. I don't know how that.
You put it up on the screen.
Yeah, I put it up on the screen and then we went away, and I don't know why we went away, but I think I figured it out. But anyways, I fixed it. So there you go. But yeah, so this is by Sean McDowell, and he talks about a lot of issues in here, and he talks about sexuality. There's another one I don't have the graphic for, but called Mere Sexuality, MERE, Mere Sexuality.
Yeah, okay, like Mere Christianity.
Yeah, and that one's a pretty good resource as well. So I think those are pretty good. I can't remember the title, but then the other one is Holy Sex by Christopher Yuan, but that really deals more with same-sex attraction than anything. But there's still some good stuff in there. I think I quoted him on Sunday too. Cool. So I think those are all really super good.
Well, John,
resources.
I think you did a good job.
Did I?
Yeah, I think you did a pretty good job. I feel good about it. And, I wasn't planning on going a certain direction. I think it led to it really well. So, yeah. John, what do you think our big idea, the big takeaway this week is?
Yeah, holy sexuality consists of two paths: chastity in singleness, and faithfulness in marriage.
Thank you for joining us on the Grace Deep Dive Podcast, where we believe in real grace for real living. We'll see you next week.